Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift gently back into a world lit by flickering gaslight, where the whiff of coal smoke mingles with a faint salt of seawater, and a strange little fashion is taking root in parlors across Britain. It's the mid 19th century, and somewhere in a cramped London drawing room, a curious hostess is peering through a glass box watching tiny bubbles rise past fronds of seaweed, while a neighbor whispers, "But won't the whole thing smell?" There's a chance you'll miss this story if your eyes grow heavy too soon, but trust me, it's worth holding on to consciousness for at least the first few minutes. So before you start to feel relaxed and drift off to sleep, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you do, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Take a moment to lower the lights, perhaps let a gentle fan whisper in the background, and slowly sink into tonight's calm together. You can almost see yourself there, trudging slowly into a Victorian hallway with a faintly uneven wooden floor boots clicking on stone before you step onto a worn rug. The air is warmer than the chilly street outside, warmed by the low hiss of a gas lamp. Through the next doorway, in the dim orange glow, sits the object of everyone's curiosity, a rectangular glass tank, its corners braced with brass strips, a wooden frame on top, polished just enough to catch the light. You lean closer and surprise it's not just water in there. Wisps of green plant life drift lazily, a few shells sit artfully on the sand at the bottom, and if you wait long enough, a silvery flicker of movement appears from behind a stone. In the early days of Aquaria, Victorians didn't yet have the tightly sealed silicone seams you see now. Instead, they dealt with the somewhat comical challenge of keeping water inside while oxygen somehow also needed to get in. The earliest tanks were often cobbled together from greenhouse glass, and whatever metalwork could be bent into shape, and yes, those seams could leak. There are diary entries from amateur naturalists, noting that they had to place pans under their aquaria to catch drips, which, if you've ever tried to nap near a leaky faucet, might explain why some tanks were eventually banished to tiled conservatories. One mainstream historical fact is that the word aquarium itself was popularized in the 1850s by Philip Henry Goss, a British naturalist who published books on marine life and described how to recreate a stable miniature seashore indoors. Before him, people had kept goldfish bowls or simple jars of plants, but Goss provided detailed instructions how much water, what plants to use, even how to control algae. Of course, his ideas assumed you could easily pop to the coast and bring back a bucket of seawater, which for Londoners meant either a day-long rail journey or a very smelly mishap in a hired carriage. And here's your quirky tidbit: some Victorians unwilling to travel tried making their own artificial seawater by dissolving a mixture of table salt and Epsom salts into clean tap water. The results varied wildly. In one case, a would-be aquarist accidentally created water so mineral-rich that it whitened the glass and convinced her guests she had discovered a new milky ocean species. She hadn't. The fish simply refused to enter the cloudy mess. Historians still argue whether the first true indoor aquaria were inspired more by scientific study or by sheer decorative vanity. Was it the naturalist's urge to observe marine ecosystems up close that drove the innovation, or was it society's hunger for the next conversational showpiece in the sitting room? As you watch the faint flicker of a fishtail in that dim parlor light, it's easy to imagine both forces swirling together like currents in the same tank. Gaslighting adds its own atmosphere here, those warm orange pools of light, reflecting off ripples in the water, casting soft patterns on the ceiling. The tank itself becomes a moving lantern show with seaweed shadows swaying gently. You sit back in a high-backed chair, the fabric slightly scratchy, and listen to a host explaining how just weeks ago this glass box was an empty frame. Now it's a living picture, something to impress guests, certainly, but also a source of quiet fascination on long winter evenings. You picture a housemaid tasked with tending it, skimming the surface with a small tin ladle to remove dust, perhaps refilling evaporated water from a jug. The whole thing is both oddly primitive and astonishing for the time. There are no air pumps humming, no heaters, just the simple balance of plants releasing oxygen during the day, fish breathing it in, and the occasional human intervention to keep things from tipping into disaster. It's a delicate truce between Victorian optimism and nature's stubborn realities. Your mind wanders to the streets outside. London is a patchwork of old stone and new iron soot, drifting down from chimneys, horses clopping along damp cobblestones. Somewhere tucked behind lace curtains, other glass tanks sit in parlors and libraries, each one a small experiment in controlling a world that was previously too vast and unruly to fit inside a home. Maybe a solicitor keeps one beside his desk, watching tiny fish circle between cases. Maybe a vicar uses his to illustrate sermons about creation and divine order. You lean back again, letting the rhythmic sway of seaweed in your mental image slow your breathing. A cat pads softly into the room, curls up on the hearth, and ignores the fish entirely. The only movement comes from the tank, small, deliberate, without hurry. It's this quality you suspect that keeps Victorians so enchanted. In a world of industrial noise and urban clutter, here is a pocket of controlled stillness. Somewhere a guest chuckles about the absurdity of keeping the sea in a box, but stays to watch anyway. The hostess smiles knowingly. After all, the aquarium isn't just about the fish. It's about the people leaning closer, whispering observations, and maybe feeling just a bit more connected to a mysterious underwater world they'll likely never dive into themselves. You linger a little longer in that lamplit parlor, letting the warmth and faint brine-scented air wrap around you. Outside, the clatter of carriage wheels fades, muffled by thick curtains. The hostess glides in with a small porcelain dish biscuits for the guests and pauses to peer into the tank with the same quiet fascination she might give a rare painting. You follow her gaze, noting how the glass distorts just slightly, making the fish appear plumper, their eyes rounder, as though the tank itself enjoys a bit of exaggeration. It's hard to imagine now, but before these tanks began to appear in respectable homes, most people only saw marine life either dried and preserved in cabinets of curiosities or dead on a fishmonger's slab. The idea of keeping living, moving sea creatures indoors felt almost like a parlor trick, half science, half magic. One mainstream historical fact is that the earliest public aquaria in Britain opened in the 1850s, including the famous display at the Regent's Park Zoological Gardens, where visitors queued to see eels, wrasse, and lobsters gliding through real seawater. Those exhibits didn't just entertain, they planted the seed in wealthy minds. If a public institution could have a living marine display, why couldn't a fashionable household? Your eyes follow a single fish as it drifts past the curved leaves of a water plant. The leaves sway ever so slightly with its movement, like stage curtains parting for an actor. There's no pump pushing the water, it's the gentle interplay of the creatures themselves and the slow convection of temperature changes. It feels alive in a way that's subtle but irresistible. You can almost hear the quiet Victorian voices debating whether this is art, nature, or something entirely new. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you grin in the rush to furnish tanks with the most authentic seashore decor. Some owners filled them with seaside pebbles still covered in seaweed, forgetting that without tidal changes, the seaweed would rot. Within days, the parlor would smell less like bracing ocean air and more like a neglected fish stall. Those who suffered this olfactory disaster often learned to favor hardy freshwater plants or dry coral for decoration instead. Historians still argue whether the popularity of home aquaria was driven more by an era-wide fascination with natural history or by sheer competitive display among the middle and upper classes. In polite society, having something new and conversation-worthy was almost as important as the quality of your tea service. An aquarium, especially one holding exotic species, could be a subtle statement that you were not only cultured, but also connected enough to acquire living creatures from far-off coasts. In one corner of your mind's eye, you picture a Victorian gentleman returning from a seaside holiday, with a sloshing tin pail in his lap. On the train, passengers politely pretending not to notice. Perhaps inside are a few shrimp, a curious goby, and a clump of eelgrass, all destined for his glass tank at home. There's a certain romance to the idea, even if the journey ends with a few escapees making their way onto the parlor carpet. The room around you in this imagined evening is thick with texture, dark wooden furniture, heavy damask curtains, a faint shimmer of brass from the fireplace grate. The aquarium's water catches and bends that firelight into rippling gold patterns on the ceiling. You lean closer to watch tiny air bubbles climb a plant stem, each one catching a miniature world in its curved surface. It's easy to see why Victorians could spend long minutes, even hours, just staring into these miniature ecosystems. You think about how the fish themselves were often caught wild rather than bred, meaning the animals in these tanks carried with them a real piece of distant shores. That in turn fed imaginations. Children and adults alike could daydream about the unseen expanses beyond Britain's coasts. A single fish darting behind a rock might suggest entire coral reefs just out of sight, much as a single sail on the horizon hints at whole fleets. In a quieter corner of the room, an elderly aunt might be knitting, glancing up occasionally to smile at the tank. She may not understand the chemistry at work, but she appreciates the calm it brings. The hostess, meanwhile, notes mentally that she'll need to top up the water tomorrow. Evaporation leaves a faint line on the glass, a quiet reminder that even small seas shrink if ignored. A coal fire snaps, releasing a puff of warmth toward your chair. The contrast between the cozy parlor air and the cool imagery of the underwater world in front of you is oddly pleasant, like sipping hot tea while watching snow fall outside. You feel yourself settling deeper into the armchair, thoughts meandering to the practical challenges these early aquarists faced. How to feed the fish without fouling the water, how to keep plants alive in the weak winter light. It's all trial and error, guided by instinct, and the occasional borrowed tip from a more experienced enthusiast. Some of those tips were inventive. A letter in a Victorian magazine once suggested that small snails be added to the tank to tidy up uneaten food and algae. The idea worked until the snails themselves multiplied to plague proportions, prompting a whole new set of letters about removing surplus mollusks without disturbing the fish. This, you think, is the charming chaos of any new hobby, unexpected problems leading to peculiar solutions. The fish flicker again, and you're pulled back to their slow, deliberate movements. In their world, the concept of time is tied to feeding and light, not clocks and appointments. Watching them, you can feel the tug of that slower rhythm, an unspoken invitation to sync your own breath with the sway of plants and the glide of fins. Beyond the glass, the streets of Victorian London go about their business lamplighters at work. A distant shout from a costermonger selling late apples. But here in the parlor, the only voices are soft, the only light, gentle. The aquarium hums quietly in its own unmechanical way, sustained by care, patience, and a little bit of stubbornness against the odds. And you realize that perhaps that's why these early tanks became so beloved. They offered a pocket of serene defiance in a world rushing toward modernity. Your thoughts drift forward, imagining the earlier moments before such a refined parlor scene could even exist. The Victorians didn't simply conjure the idea of an aquarium out of thin air. It began humbly in the briny shallows of the British coast. You picture yourself stepping carefully over slippery stones at low tide, the air heavy with the tang of salt and kelp. Somewhere in the distance, a gull complains about your intrusion. It was here in these tidal rock pools that amateur naturalists found their first inspiration. One mainstream historical fact is that during the 1840s and 50s, seaweed hunting and shore collecting became fashionable seaside activities, especially for women in crinolines, who perhaps preferred crouching daintily over rocks to clambering into fishing boats. Armed with wicker baskets, tin pails, and occasionally magnifying glasses, these seaside wanderers collected small crustacean shells and fronds of vividly colored algae. The very notion of bringing the sea home still alive took root in these excursions. You crouch in the shallows in your mind's eye, hands dipped into a cold, clear pool where miniature worlds thrive, tiny fish darting between strands of green weed anemones, opening and closing like curious little mouths. It's easy to understand how addictive the habit could become. One quirky tidbit, some early collectors became so smitten with their finds that they attempted to fill entire bathtubs with seawater to keep them alive. Without understanding oxygen exchange or waste buildup, these impromptu bathtub aquariums often turned into still life studies within days, beautiful but decidedly motionless. Historians still argue whether these seaside gatherings were primarily a form of genteel recreation or a genuine step toward citizen science. On one hand, they brought everyday people into close contact with marine life. On the other, they occasionally reduced complex ecosystems to a kind of temporary ornamentation. The truth, as always, may lie in both. From those informal collections grew a more deliberate approach. You imagine the careful selection of stones with interesting textures, each one turned over to reveal a hidden crab or cluster of limpets. Perhaps you wrap the seaweed in damp cloth to preserve its color and freshness for the long journey home. The train carriage smells faintly of salt and iodine as you ride back toward the city, your lap crowded with small containers that slosh with every turn. A fellow passenger casts a wary glance when a hermit crab taps gently against the side of a jar. These early collectors weren't entirely guessing, though. Articles and pamphlets circulated offering advice on transporting marine life. Keep the water cool, avoid overcrowding, change it regularly. Still without pumps or filters, many found that keeping a piece of the sea alive inland was as tricky as keeping a snowflake from melting. The challenge itself became part of the allure, a puzzle to solve for those who enjoyed tinkering with both nature and contraptions. Your bare feet crunch over shells as you continue along this imaginary shoreline. Children dart ahead, shrieking when a wavelet surprises them, but they quickly return to scanning the sand for treasures. In the shallows, a flatfish shifts under a thin blanket of silt, disappearing in an instant, a reminder that even the smallest tide pool can hold mysteries. Victorian seaside resorts encouraged this fascination. Hotels sometimes offered marine displays in glass jars, refreshed daily from the shore. Guests could gaze at starfish and tiny blennies while sipping tea in seaside lounges. You can almost see it, the glass, slightly clouded from salt, deposits the creatures inside, oblivious to the human stares. Such displays hinted at what might be possible if one could stabilize an environment indoors. You stoop to pick up a fragment of coral white, and delicate its branches like frozen lace. It's been bleached by sun and sea, no longer living, but in the Victorian imagination, such items were perfect for decorating an indoor tank. Some enthusiasts took the aesthetics very seriously, arranging stone shells and even small statues to create an underwater tableau worthy of a still life painting. Of course, moving from tide pool to parlor tank required more than decoration. You imagine Victorian minds whirring late into the night by candlelight, sketching out possible designs, glass panes sealed with putty frames of iron or brass, and a way to keep the water fresh without direct access to the sea. A few ambitious souls even experimented with wheeled carts to shuttle seawater inland from the coast, filling barrels for use in their tanks. One can picture the startled horses uneasy about hauling such sloshing, salty cargo. As you step back from the waterline in this mental stroll, the sun lowers, casting a soft amber glow across the wet sand. The horizon blurs where sky meets sea, and for a moment you can almost hear the first Victorian whispers about bringing the shore indoors. It must have sounded mad to some. After all, the sea was vast, unpredictable, and alive in ways difficult to contain. But to others, that was the point. The aquarium would not be a static specimen case. It would be a living, breathing fragment of another world. A small boy nearby tugs at his mother's skirt, proudly showing her a tiny shrimp cupped in his palm. She smiles, kneels, and lets it slip back into the pool. Maybe she's thinking about the impracticality of keeping such a thing alive at home. Or maybe she's already picturing how it would look gliding through water in a glass case on their mantle. The tide begins to creep back in, swallowing the pools one by one. You feel the chill of the advancing water and step back onto dry sand, your hands full of imagined Victorian treasures. As the waves reclaim the shore, you can't help but notice how easily the sea reorders itself, erasing footprints and rearranging shells. For all the Victorians' ingenuity, they could never fully replicate that constant renewal indoors. But that didn't stop them from trying again and again to capture a fragment of this shifting, breathing world. And so from these quiet beaches and glistening pools, the first true indoor aquariums began their slow journey toward existence, rooted in curiosity, tempered by trial and error, and buoyed by a desire to keep the sea close, even when the tide was far away. Back in your mind's quiet Victorian parlor, the next stage of the story takes shape not with salty breezes and wet hymns, but with precise inky words printed in neat columns. Before aquariums could truly become a household fixture, they needed instructions, and for that the Victorians had books. And when Victorians wrote books, they didn't skimp on detail or flourish. You picture yourself in a well-lit bookshop on a drizzly London morning. The air is warm and faintly scented with ink and paper. Shelves are stacked with volumes bound in embossed cloth, their titles picked out in gold leaf that glints when the gaslights flicker. Somewhere between guides on fern keeping and treatises on bird fancying, you spot one with a curious title, The Aquarium, an unveiling of the wonders of the deep. A long-winded subtitle promises full instructions for the formation, furnishing, stocking, and maintaining of marine and freshwater tanks for the instruction and amusement of the family. One mainstream historical fact slips in here. Philip Henry Goss, a naturalist with a fondness for meticulous observation, published one of the first popular aquarium manuals in 1854, simply titled The Aquarium. His descriptions of marine life combined scientific rigor with a flair for the poetic, making the book as much a source of bedtime reading as practical instruction. You imagine a reader under the lamplight, lost in Goss's lush depictions of anemones opening like stars and tiny crabs scuttling like busy housemaids. And then there were the diagrams, beautiful engravings of tanks with side panels and careful cross-sections showing layers of gravel plants and hidden spaces for shy fish. You run your finger along an imagined plate illustration, noting every fine line, every deliberate hatch that hints at depth in a world otherwise flat on paper. It's almost like a promise: follow these steps, and you too can have a piece of the ocean in your sitting room. The quirky tidbit here is how some manuals wandered into unexpectedly philosophical territory. Between instructions on rinsing gravel and feeding minnows, you'd find asides on the moral benefits of observing nature. Watching fish, some writers argued, instilled patience, humility, and a respect for divine creation. In other words, your aquarium wasn't just a decorative whim, it was a miniature cathedral of learning and virtue. Whether this pious pitch was sincere or simply a clever marketing ploy is well debatable. Historians still argue whether these publications were primarily practical guides or lifestyle manifestos. Some see them as vital tools for amateur science, democratizing marine biology for the middle class. Others suspect they were as much about selling the idea of genteel refinement as about preserving fish. After all, nothing said, we are cultured quite like having an elegantly arranged aquarium in the drawing room. You linger in this imagined shop, flipping through another volume, this one illustrated with hand-tinted plates, showing exotic fish in improbable colors. Perhaps the tinting was more about pleasing the Victorian eye than accurately portraying nature. In reality, that dazzling turquoise fish might be more modest in hue, but on paper it shimmered with almost fairy tale brilliance. You can almost hear a bookseller assuring a skeptical customer, "Yes, madam, it will look exactly like this in your parlor." The manuals didn't stop at fish care, they included shopping lists. The tone was brisk but encouraging. Procure a vessel of stout plate glass, well bound in iron, a layer of well-washed sand, a few pieces of rock for ornamentation, living plants for oxygenation. You picture yourself dutifully checking each item off, then glancing toward your spouse with a half-serious suggestion that the dining table could surely accommodate such a tank if the roast were moved elsewhere. Some authors even included ideal viewing schedules, suggesting that family members spend a certain number of minutes each morning and evening observing their aquariums. It reads a little like a Victorian workout regimen, but for the eyes and the soul. You imagine a household where after supper everyone dutifully gathers to watch the fish, perhaps commenting on the improved health of the seaweed or the boldness of the shrimp. You turn another page and find a section on seasonal care. The idea of summer and winter aquarium management feels quaint, especially the advice to wrap the tank in flannel during cold months as though the goldfish might catch a chill. A mental image flashes of a plump red and gold carp peeking out from under a tiny tartan blanket, a picture that would make any modern aquarist chuckle. The manuals also stress the importance of light. One entry recommends situating the tank where it might receive the gentle morning sun, but not the fierce glare of the midday blaze. You can almost see the elaborate calculations which window faced east, how far the light would reach across the floor, whether the family cat could be trusted not to interfere. Perhaps most fascinating were the suggested social benefits of aquarium keeping. Beyond moral uplift, the books hinted at conversational advantages. Guests might be charmed, children edified, and visiting clergy suitably impressed. The aquarium could be a centerpiece for everything from courtship to theological debate. You picture a bashful young man lingering by the tank, fumbling for conversation as he points out the graceful glide of a loach, while his intended pretends not to notice his reflection in the glass. As you close the imaginary book, the rain outside the shop eases, and the gaslights glow a little warmer. The clerk wraps your purchase in brown paper and ties it with twine. Under your arm, the weight of the volume feels like possibility itself. The possibility that soon in your own parlor, you'll have a living scene to rival the illustrations. You step out into the damp street boots, tapping on cobblestones, the package safe in your grasp. You don't yet know that your journey will involve leaky seams, mysteriously vanishing fish, and the occasional overgrowth of algae. But for now, you carry the perfect printed dream of an aquarium untouched by the practicalities that reality will eventually impose. The walk back from the bookshop feels oddly buoyant, as if the rain-slicked cobblestones themselves approve of your new venture. The paper-wrapped volume is tucked under your arm like a cherished loaf of bread, only instead of feeding your stomach, it will feed your imagination. By the time you push open the door to your Victorian parlor, you already know the exact spot where your aquarium will sit, right between the polished walnut writing desk and the overstuffed armchair you pretend not to nap in. Victorian parlors were the stage on which middle-class life performed its daily scenes. This was not just a room. It was a carefully curated statement to any visitor who crossed the threshold. The sofa with its prim antimacassars, the china dog figurines staring blankly from the mantel, the ticking brass clock all contributed to a sense of taste stability and perhaps just a hint of showing off. Adding an aquarium was like placing an exclamation point in the middle of that sentence. Here's your mainstream historical fact: by the mid-19th century, parlors had become the default location for home aquariums, partly because they were the most public space in the house, and partly because they were already decorated with the kind of ornamentation that made an aquarium feel at home. It's also where your best glassware would glisten in lamplight, and a tank full of moving, shimmering life made an even grander display. The quirky tidbit comes in the form of Victorian furniture adaptation. Some enthusiasts commissioned special aquarium stands, polished mahogany frames with turned legs and brass fittings so that their tanks looked like pieces of fine furniture rather than glass boxes plonked on a table. Others simply cleared space on a tea trolley, a solution both practical and faintly absurd, especially when the trolley's wheels made the fish tremble during a particularly vigorous game of charades. Historians still argue whether parlors truly served the fish's needs or merely their owners' egos. The room's warmth from the fireplace could be a blessing in winter, but the flicker of flames and noise of conversation might have unsettled more sensitive species. There's also the matter of air quality. Gas lamps and coal fires did no favors for the oxygen content of water. Yet somehow many fish thrived, perhaps bolstered by the careful if sometimes overzealous attention of their keepers. You imagine yourself clearing a space on the sideboard, sweeping aside a vase of dried flowers, and a stack of well-thumbed periodicals. The book lies open, showing the recommended dimensions of a small marine tank. Your fingers trace the lines of the diagram, and you begin to imagine the frame. A simple iron band for stability, or perhaps a finer brass edge if you're feeling flush. Light, the manual insists, is critical. You draw the curtains halfway, testing how the morning sun might strike the spot at different times. In your mind, the fish become little actors, and you are the lighting director, ensuring they are illuminated just enough to show their best scales without frying them like Sunday breakfast kippers. The manual's advice on decoration makes you chuckle. Avoid the gaudy and artificial. Nature's own embellishments suffice. This, in a culture that adored heavily patterned wallpapers and fringed everything. Still, you take it to heart, imagining smooth river stones and modest greenery rather than the temptation of painted ceramic castles. The soundscape of the parlor also plays in your thoughts. On a quiet afternoon, you hear the muffled clip-clop of hooves in the street, the occasional clink of china from the kitchen, and now, if you lean close, the faint, almost secretive gurgle of water in your soon-to-be tank. That soft sound becomes part of the room's rhythm, a liquid counterpoint to the ticking of the clock and the rustle of skirts. You picture hosting visitors. The aquarium sits prominently, the glass polished to a sparkle, its surface catching lamplight. A guest approaches, peers in, and offers some polite remark about the grace of the fish. Another leans too close, fogging the glass slightly, and you smile, imagining the fish peering back with equal curiosity. In this room, the aquarium becomes both a conversation starter and a quiet retreat. On afternoons when the rain keeps you indoors, you settle in the armchair with a cup of tea, letting your eyes wander from the printed words of a novel to the slow ballet of aquatic life just a few feet away. It's a sort of moving picture years before such things existed in theaters, except here the actors improvise endlessly, and no two scenes are ever the same. You run through the logistics in your head. How will you fetch seawater for a marine tank in a landlocked town? Will you hire a boy from the docks to carry buckets? Will you brace yourself, attempt the artificial seawater recipe detailed in the book, with its improbable list of salts and minerals measured out in drams and scruples? The thought makes you both eager and faintly apprehensive, like planning an elaborate dinner, without knowing if the guests will enjoy it. Even the process of cleaning the tank takes on a genteel drama in your imagination. The manual recommends a small net, a long-handled brush, and a steady hand. You imagine wielding these tools with the solemnity of a surgeon. The parlor hushed as you gently lift out a plant for trimming or remove a snail that has wandered too far. Somewhere between daydream and plan, the parlor becomes a stage, and you, a rather self-satisfied stage manager, ready to introduce this living tableau to your household. The fish will come later. For now, the empty space on the sideboard is its own kind of promise, waiting to be filled. And as the rain patters lightly on the window, you lean back, picturing how the light will catch the water on a sunny day, scattering little ripples of brightness across the wallpaper. It will be, you decide, not just an aquarium, but a polite rebellion against the static order of the parlor, a bit of moving nature framed in glass, quietly defying the stillness of all those porcelain dogs. You step out of your snug parlor fantasy and into a larger echoing hall, where the hush of water becomes something grander, an indoor tide held in iron and glass. Your boots click softly on stone. Somewhere above, a skylight milks the London daylight into a pale wash, and along one wall, a procession of glass fronts gleams like a row of framed seascapes. You've arrived at the great public spectacle, the aquarium as attraction, a place where whole families drift past tanks as if strolling beside a captive shoreline. You don't cough from coal smoke here. The air is cool, faintly saline, and threaded with whispers. Look there the rays, is that an eel or a ribbon that escaped? Mind your bonnet, dear, the octopus does not sign autographs. One mainstream historical fact anchors you in 1853. The Zoological Society of London opened the fish house at Regent's Park, commonly hailed as the world's first public aquarium. The word aquarium had only just been popularized, and now here it stood as architecture, a purpose-built gallery, where Philip Henry Goss's ideas swam behind plate glass for ticket holders. The effect on the public was instant. People who had known the sea only as a horizon or a holiday wade could suddenly stand nose to glass with moray scowls, crab choreography, and anemones opening like slow fireworks. A parlor conversation piece had become a civic spectacle. You let yourself be carried along by the crowd, each tank a novella with its own mood-lighting gaslight, which is a mood even when no one asks for it. Iron ribs hold up the roof. Tiled floors reflect shy ripples. The curators learned quickly how to stage their scenes. Rocky grottos for sulking fish, sandy pans for the flounder who perform invisibility like salaried magicians, and columns of eelgrass that nod politely whenever a shoal sweeps past. A child presses a mittened hand to the glass mouth round with awe. You feel the old parlor tug in your chest again, the same hush expanded to cathedral scale. The signage talks softly of natural history, but the theater is undeniable. An attendant in a dark coat tells you to step a touch back for the animal's ease, sir, and you oblige, half relieved not to be drafted as a volunteer in an eel demonstration. You catch the faintest tremor in the glass, the pulse of weight you do not control. It's paradoxically soothing, the knowledge that the water is vast enough to make you small, but contained enough not to wet your cuffs. Of course, the logistics behind this serenity are anything but serene. Remember your leaky home seams, multiply by 10, and add an audience. Tanks need constant tending, fresh water, stable temperature oxygen. In the early installations, attendants learned to open ventilation slats, regulate gas jets, and swap seaweed before it turned from charming decor to cautionary tale. And here's your quirky tidbit. One popular exhibition kept a spare set of showstones. Clean, algae-free rocks rotated in at dawn so the public would never see the tanks in their morning bedhead condition. Nature, but after a gentle comb through. You pause at a long window where skates drift over sand like polite ghosts. A docent points out the gill slits with a silver wand so slender it could stir a teacup. School children lean forward as if magnetized. One raises a hand. Do they sting? The docent smiles, only if annoyed. We have a pact to remain mutually unannoyed. You can't help a quiet laugh. The skate inscrutable signs no paperwork. Historians still argue whether these public aquaria were chiefly engines of education or engines of entertainment. Was the aim to democratize science, to let clerks and seamstresses witness the living sea, or to fill turnstiles with a tasteful thrill between the lion house and the pastry stall? The answer likely swims in the middle water. People came for a spectacle and left with a vocabulary. Gills, siphons, polyps tucked beside their ticket stubs. Even the staging advanced science. Curators learned which plants oxygenated best, which rock arrangements reduced quarrels, which lighting coaxed nocturnal fish to show up for matinees. You drift toward a darker gallery where octopuses star in slow-motion detective films of their own making. One unspools over a jar cork already loosened, someone forgot to tighten it. Someone always forgets to tighten it, and the creature's arms map the problem with eerie grace. The crowd murmurs, equal parts admiration, and is that jar on the inventory list? Your second light joke arrives by itself. A father whispers, "Don't let it near mother's pickle pots." And his companion nods gravely, as if domestic cephalopod theft were a documented suburban menace. Beyond the glass, other experiments play out. Some tanks are seawater hauled in casks, replenished on a schedule as fussy as a duke's diary. Others rely on the latest recipes for artificial sea laboratory salts, whisked into filtered water until the hydrometer sings the right note. You remember your own kitchen chemist ambitions, weighing powders in drams like a pastry cook for mermaids. The public gallery is simply a better funded version of your parlor problem: balance, oxygen, waste light, and temperature. Then smile as though it were effortless. Bigger cities race to keep pace. Brighton will build a majestic aquarium on the seafront. Inland towns flirt with smaller halls where goldfish do their gilded loops between urns. Traveling exhibitions roll in with posters promising wonders of the deep, and occasionally fearsome monsters, which turn out reassuringly to be lobsters in a mood. Your third gentle joke writes itself when an usher assures a nervous visitor, The monster never bites on Thursdays, and the lobster duly constrained by glass and custom keeps to its union rules. You notice too the way the public space reframes social space. Here the classes rub shoulders without awkward calling cards. Here children elbow toward the rail while their elders read captions aloud. A sailor on leave leans close to point a detail you would have missed the way an anemone's mouth tightens when a shrimp blunders into its fringe. A governess repeats the term cnidarian, so her charges can parade it later at tea. The aquarium levels the room, curiosity outranks rank for a few quiet minutes. Behind the scenes, the workhum's nightkeepers do rounds with the lanterns. Someone logs water clarity in a damp notebook you picture smudged ink and proud underlines. Someone else trains docents to say more and not moron, which has surely happened at least once. The city outside pushes and clanks and bargains. Inside, the tide turns on the half hour by human hands. The edges of spectacle blur into public health and urban planning. Ventilation light wells and water supply become as critical as ticket prices. Engineers design clever flows so fresh water sweeps in low and exits high, carrying haze with it. A few halls install early mechanical aerators, a wheeze and bubble that sounds like a sleeping giant in a respectable suit. Visitors barely notice the machinery. They're watching the fish breathe, not the building. Still, no amount of iron resolve can erase every mishap. A crab scales a poorly sealed corner and makes for the ladies' corridor. Gallant chaos ensues, nothing scandalous, only a great deal of strategic hat lifting. Anemones sulk after a cold snap. A single eel dominates a tank like a baron at a village fete, until redistributed to more suitable company, the eel writes no apology. These small dramas are edited out of the brochures but whispered fondly by keepers on tea breaks. You circle back toward the entrance, and the space feels different now, familiar, almost domestic, as if the city has acquired a giant parlor tank that everyone shares. You think of your sideboard at home, the spot you measured for gentle morning light. Public spectacle and private solace mirror one another. Both curate the sea into human rooms. Both soothe overworked minds with a choreography older than engines. If your parlor is an exclamation point, this hall is a paragraph. Still, the sentence reads the same: watch, breathe. Be small for a moment, then carry the calm with you. As you step out into the street, the sky is chalky and kind. Somewhere a poster flaps, living wonders within, and you smile at the earnestness. Wonders, yes, but also work glass wiped water. Weighed plants persuaded to play along. You tuck that knowledge beside your ticket stub like a secret. The spectacle dazzles, the maintenance endures, and between them a culture learns how to keep a slice of ocean alive under its own roof. You carry the calm of that public hall back into your own thoughts, and without changing your pace, slip into the gentler fray that blooms wherever people compare notes, the debate over which small sea you should keep at home. You can hear it already in drawing rooms, mechanics' institutes, and little naturalists' clubs tucked above bookshops. The saltwater people versus the freshwater people, both convinced their glass world is lovelier, pure, easier, or at least less likely to turn into a green soup between Thursdays. Someone passes you a plate of seed cake, and with equal courtesy and opinion. Marine tanks, she declares, are the true theaters. Anemones, flowers that eat, and curious crabs doing their sideways ballet. You nod, picturing the rocky grottos you just admired behind iron and glass. Across from her, a gentleman in a neatly brushed coat lifts an eyebrow. Freshwater, he counters, is the gentleman's choice. Clean ponds in miniature, none of this business of carting half the channel up the stairs. The room hums like a hive, but politely. This is Victorian rivalry, all velvet gloves and pointed footnotes. Your mainstream historical fact gives you a steady rung to hold. Before Goss popularized the marine aquarium, the chemist Robert Warrington had already shown, around 1850 at the Royal Institution, that a small balanced freshwater tank could sustain fish with the help of aquatic plants. Gaslit photosynthesis by day, quiet breathing by night. In other words, you didn't need a tide to keep a little world ticking. You needed the right neighbors in the water. That proof made bowls and boxes of goldfish and sticklebacks not merely ornaments, but experiments with a method. Your mind flips through parlor memories, the leaky seams, the tea trolley trembling like a nervous stage, the bookshop diagrams promising harmony if you layer the gravel correctly. Freshwater people love that promise. They praise the thrift, a stroll to the pond, instead of a train to the coast. Lilies and elidea, rather than fragile sea fringes that sulk away from sunlight. Their tanks are the quiet hedgerows of the aquarist world, modest, green, well-mannered. Observe the restraint one hostess whispers to you, gesturing at a shoal of minnows, nibbling invisible appetizers. No gaudy circus. But across the carpet, the saltwater set leans in, eyes bright. They recall the first time an anemone opened in their sitting room like a slow red star, the moment a shrimp's transparent legs moved over shell grit as if walking on crystal. They argue that the seawater tableau with its shells and tassels of weed is not a circus, but a chapel, a polychrome one perhaps, but still devoted. They smuggle a little bravado into their voices too. Anyone can keep a goldfish alive, they say. It takes a certain nerve and a certain nose to steward a tide beneath the mantle. Your first light joke arrives when a gentleman waves a slender hydrometer like a conductor's baton and declares precision is the soul of the sea, while his friend lacking an instrument dips a finger into his artificial brine and pronounces tastes correct. You make a face you hope reads as supportive. Privately, you decide the tongue is an unreliable scientific gauge that ought to be reserved for jam. Freshwater advocates bring out their star witness, the goldfish. Once exotic, now increasingly common, it glows like a small hearth ember in glass, and it tolerates the drafts of British houses with saintly patience. Children name them. Elderly aunts begin to confide in them. Vicars use them to illustrate sermons about temperance. Goldfish drink only water after all. There's a practical point here. Goldfish forgive mistakes that would cause a marine tank to stage a very damp tragedy. You remember your own manual's flannel wrapping suggestion for winter, and imagine a goldfish peeking from a tartan muffler, an image too charming to be responsibly scientific. Meanwhile, the saltwater side opens its specimen case of wonders, hermit crabs changing lodgings like landlords with whims, little blennies popping from holes with the comic timing of actors, snails that polish the glass overnight as if paid. It is a city, a devotee tells you, only quieter. You can see the point. The marine tank crackles with a drama of gestures so small, they could be punctuation commas of antenna semicolons of claws. Historians still argue whether the fashion divided along class as much as chemistry. Where marine tanks with the cost of salt mixes coastal trips and occasional please don't spill that on the stair carpet, scandals a wealthier person's badge did freshwater with its pond net outings, and fern-cased neighbors suit the comfortable middle. The diaries are coy and the shop ledgers equivocal. You hear scraps of evidence in club minutes fees for seawater casks, hear notes on lily pond outings there, and the conclusion slides around like a bottom dweller that refuses to be pinned. Quirky tidbit time, an inland apothecary you visit in your mind's wandering stocks. Seawater genuine per gallon, corked up like medicine, with a handwritten note advising gentle warming near the hearth to wake the anemones. Another shop, bolder yet, advertises delivery of periwinkles by post, promising they will arrive merry. You picture a letter carrier with a suspiciously sloshing satchel and resolve to tip generously. Back at the drawing room debate, the freshwater partisans parade their virtues, clarity, thrift, the educational serenity of pond plants, spiraling oxygen as neatly as a copybook hand. They sing the praises of sticklebacks, feisty but instructive of gudgeon, unassuming but solid of ram's horn snails, decorative and industrious unless they take the hint too literally and become a guild. Your second gentle joke bubbles up when a matron announces she has a dozen staff engaged in sanitation, then admits they are all snails with no wages and a poor record on window corners. Saltwater admirers counter with variety and color, the satisfaction of solving a puzzle daily. They accept the failures wilting weed tactless crabs, that one eel who believes in annexation as the price of vistas otherwise unavailable in brick and soot London. Besides, a man with sand still in his cuffs says it keeps me honest. If the sea begins to smell, the fault is mine, not the moon's. The room laughs softly. You remember the public hall's tidy trick with the showstones and decide that honesty sometimes needs a quick wash and a new hat. Someone recalls your earlier visit to Regent's Park, and you notice a subtle shift the big tanks have taught the little ones. Interior arrangements in home aquaria now echo the public style's rock ledges for retreat open sand for the shyer souls. A plant or two placed not for your eye, but for the fish to graze. The rivalry has in a way improved both camps. The freshwater keepers borrow marine staging, the saltwater keepers adopt freshwater discipline. A schoolroom bell somewhere nearby clangs the hour. Tea is poured. The debate softens from thesis to anecdote. You settle into the hush that comes after opinions have had their say. Your third light joke tiptoes in when a boy insists his goldfish prefers sermons to music because it swims faster during hymns. His mother corrects him gently. He prefers crumbs, which, you must admit, has the ring of empirical truth. In your own chest, the scales tip, then level. You imagine the morning light touching a freshwater pane, leaves releasing small silver pearls like a string of quiet bells. You imagine the evening lamp leaning over a marine pane, anemones yawning like red flowers at bedtime. You can keep either world if you keep your promises to attend to change water, to resist the impulse to fuss every hour. The choice you realize is less about species than about the rhythm you want in your room. As the gathering disperses, someone presses a pamphlet into your hand. On the relative merits of river and sea, its type crowded its arguments earnest. You tuck it next to your manual's flannel advice, and your memory of the skate's polite ghostly drift. On the way home, the street smells of damp wool and bakery sugar. A window glows. Somewhere a cat inspects a bowl, and with feline diplomacy decides not to interfere. By the time you step into your own parlor, the debate has untied his gloves and gone to bed. Your sideboard space still waits measuring light like a sundial. Whether you pour pawn into it or tide, the promise is the same, that the slow-breathing picture behind glass will teach you to linger, to look closer, to become, if only for a few steady minutes each day, the kind of Victorian who learned to keep bubbles alive. You set your pamphlet down, pick up your imaginary timetable, and discover that the next chapter in your quiet aquarium adventure doesn't smell of jasmine polish or fern cases. It smells faintly of brine iron and locomotive steam. If you want a bit of ocean in the parlor, you must persuade that ocean to travel, and in the 19th century that means barrels porters and a very understanding station master. You move through the morning like a careful conspirator, hat on basket, in hand coins ready for tips and a penciled list that reads like the world's oddest shopping errand. Anemones, eelgrass, seawater, perhaps a crab if he minds his manners. The railway platform inhales and exhales people. Porters slide trolleys past wicker hampers and hat boxes while you stand guard over a stout-lidded tin, the fish can, whose handle bites your palm each time you lift it to keep the contents swishing. One mainstream historical fact steadies your feet. By the 1850s, the railway network had matured enough that naturalists, public aquaria, and enthusiastic householders could move live specimens quickly from coast to city. Newspapers even printed little notes about curious marine creatures conveyed by rail, and manuals soberly advised travelers to keep water cool shaded and gently agitated to keep oxygen high. In other words, you are not alone on this platform with your damp ambitions. Your train heaves into view, pistons sigh brass, catches the weak sun, and the guard eyes your can, with a look that says he has seen stranger freight he has. Last week, it was a traveling mesmerist with 2 geese and an attitude. You climb into a compartment and set the can by your boot's lid propped a finger's width to invite fresh air but not catastrophe. The carriage tilts into motion, and you begin your ritual every few minutes. You tip the can, letting the water roll over itself. A hand-cranked ocean that keeps your passengers breathing. Opposite you, a lady lowers her veil and says, "Seasick at sea." I understand. Seasick on the Midland Line is a novelty. Your first light joke blushes into the air when you reply, "Madam, the fish are excellent travelers. It is I who may require a paper bag." Some trips are longer or worse delayed, and that's when the ingenuity begins. You've packed a felt-lined wrap to keep the can cool, a cousin to the flannel you once wrapped around a winter tank, and a sprig of eelgrass to add a dash of oxygen. The manual advised both, but added a scolded postscript against overstocking, no omnibus crowding even for starfish. You remember a friend's story of a porter who, worried by the silent cargo in a crate marked live marine, tapped twice and asked, "Shall I open a window for the anemones?" Kindly meant disastrous if obeyed. The anemones, to their credit, lodged no complaint in writing. At the next stop, you step down to the platform and negotiate a splash of fresh seawater from a cooperative bucket at the end of the goods van. Arrangements like these often appear in club minutes, and naturalist letters you've read, and some coastal stations kept a cistern for such exchanges. Quirky tidbit, a few clever vendors labeled bottles genuine seawater per gallon, and shipped them inland like medicine. One even threw in a tiny printed blessing, "Stir gently to wake the polyps." You imagine the postmaster's face when a parcel sloshes and a pink shrimp waves cheerfully from the knothole. Your mind wanders to bigger endeavors, and you picture the inland museum that schedules monthly water days when a hired cart receives barrels from the morning train and rumbles them to a service yard where attendants roll them like casks to aerate the lot. A clerk in a tidy hand logs 5 casks, received 2 with leakage, then tucks the book away, as if he hasn't just recorded the most Victorian sentence ever written. Historians still argue whether institutions like the Fish House in Regent's Park relied more on regular deliveries from the coast or on artificial mixes prepared on site in the earliest months. The surviving notes record both practices in overlapping years, like two tides that refuse to agree on a schedule. Your compartment settles into that pleasant railway rhythm, joint, rail, and you count along 1-2 tip the can. You recall advice to rest the container on a folded newspaper, to soften vibrations today's headlines, become tomorrow's fish mattress, and advice to keep the lid weighted with a stone, so an inquisitive crab doesn't pry its way to a tour of third class. Your second light joke arrives when you picture a conductor punching tickets and asking the hermit crab single or return. The crab, being a traditionalist, remains silent. The logistics chain lengthens in your imagination. From shore collector to coastal shop, from shop to rail, from rail to cab, from cab to your doorstep, from doorstep to the sideboard where the tank waits with the patient expectancy of a stage before curtain. Each handoff is a kindness or a calamity. A shaded window in the cab earns your gratitude. A jolt over paving stones earns muttered promises to petition the council about road quality for the sake of echinoderms. Someone somewhere has telegraphed ahead. Specimens arriving noon have tank prepared, and you can almost hear the impatient hiss of gas in the parlor, the little world ready to receive its citizens. Not every passenger is a fish. Plants ride the rails, tucked in damp moss, their fronds coiled like sleeping cats. Seaweeds arrive looking surly, but revive when unfurled in cool water. A bag of snails tied carefully and hung inside the can to share oxygen without sharing opinions, descends into the tank on arrival, and gets straight to work, union or no union. The most fragile animals, anemones, small blennies, sometimes travel in nested jars, inside the can water, within tin like a set of portable seas. A keeper you know swears by adding a smooth pebble from the destination tank into the travel jar so they may smell their new home in advance, which is sweet if unprovable and harms no one. There are inevitably mishaps that become lore. A slow goods train turns a 3-hour journey into 6, and a harried telegraph goes out requesting urgent attention upon arrival. Oxygen scant. A winter cold snap ices the carriage window and chills the can enough that you spend 2 stations wrapping it in your coat, composing an apologetic sermon to your future anemones about British weather. A well-meaning cousin carries a backup can halfway across town and explains to a constable with a straight face that he is escorting periwinkles to a respectable address. The constable, impressed by civic purpose, clears the way. By the time your train rolls into the city, you feel you've done a day's work and you haven't even lifted the parlor lid. You enlist a cab and cradle the can on your knees, bracing it with both hands whenever the wheels find a rut. Home at last you pour, with the care of a pharmacist, letting the travelers slide into their appointed scene-weed. Here stone there, a little cave for shyness, a length of sand for boldness. The room's air feels different for a moment, cooler maybe, or simply more awake, because you've stitched 2 places together, shore and sideboard. You clean the tin, set it to dry, and tuck your timetable into the manual, where the flannel advice keeps company with your notes on showstones. You write a tiny entry: specimens arrived in good order. Eelgrass plucky, 1 shrimp auditioning for escape artist. And feel the gentle pride of a keeper whose plan survived contact with reality. Then you sit finally and the day quiets around you while oxygen finds its lanes and gills settle into their measured work. Your third light joke peeks in when the cat who has ignored every human project in the house takes a single bored glance at the tank and decides the bubble stream is beneath comment. You nod, honored by the snub, and file it with other omens that mean nothing and everything. The train ran on time, the porter didn't sneeze. The eel chose the polite end of the tank. Later, as lamplight warms the glass, you think about how much invisible choreography lay behind this calm rail: schedules, cork stoppers, cab fares, damp cloths, and patient hands. The aquarium is never just a box of water. It's a corridor through which people, ports, and timetables carry breath from one world to another. The Victorians, for all their fuss and flannel and fondness for labeling jars, were good at corridors. They built them in iron and steam. You've built one in tin and care. Tomorrow you may go to the park and watch the great public tanks glow like polite thunderheads. Tonight you watch your small ocean keep its promise, and you keep yours, listening to the house settle, measuring out a last quiet minute for the eelgrass to breathe and the shrimp to decide at last that staying put is also a kind of travel. You ease back into your parlor and discover that once a glass box enters a Victorian room, the room begins to rearrange itself around it like furniture courting a celebrity. Wood gleams a shade brighter. Brass polishes itself with human help, alas. Curtains learn to fall, just so catching the light that will skim the water at 4 in the afternoon. The aquarium invites an entourage, a stand, a frame, a bell of glass, a small forest of companion objects that whisper the same sentence, look, but quietly. Your stand is first to audition. A plain table will do, says your thrifty voice. Your showman's voice coughs politely and unveils walnut with carved dolphin feet, or a cast iron pedestal with scrollwork that seems to swish its tail when the fire flickers. Mainstream historical fact glides in with its calling card mid-century, Britain-adored display furniture, and the Gothic revival and later aesthetic fashions sent carved oak fretwork and Japan surfaces into respectable homes. Aquaria joined fern cases and stuffed bird domes on purpose-built stands that elevated nature to eye level. You run a finger over a sample molding and think the fish do not care, but I do. Frames follow. Some makers add a modest cornice to hide the upper rim. Others go full theater, building a miniature proscenium with gilded rosettes. A few enthusiasts commission mirrored backs to multiply plants into dream groves so that 3 sprigs of eelgrass pose convincingly as a woodland. The result is delightful and slightly disorienting when a lone blenny appears to have 6 identical cousins with synchronized ambitions. Your first light joke tiptoes in. You assure a guest the fish are not multiplying, merely unionizing their reflections, and the blenny being management refuses comment. Decor begins to colonize nearby surfaces. You set a small tray of seaweed specimens pressed and mounted like botanical lace beside the tank, their fronds preserved into long green size. Shells line up along the mantel, their pearly throats catching lamplight. A glass cloche shelters a particularly fragile sponge. Retired from tank duty, after sulking you label it with a neat hand, because what is the Victorian home if not a museum with cake? Across the room, a fern in a Wardian case nods companionably. The Wardian case, you remind yourself, being that earlier glass craze devised by Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, a mainstream triumph of plants under glass that taught parlors how to nurse miniature climates. Your aquarium looks over and says quietly, cousin. Shapes grow fanciful. Not content with rectangles, some households flirt with bowfront panes that curve like ship windows, or with octagons that make the water read as jewel. A rare brave soul orders a table aquarium, a circular tank on high legs with a hinged lid so guests can lean over their teacups and watch shrimp conduct tiny diplomatic missions on the sand below. Quirky tidbit period advertisements occasionally boasted of aquarium work tables whose tops hid shallow tanks beneath removable embroidery lids. You picture a stern aunt lifting her needlework to reveal an anemone and announcing we are taking turns being decorative. Historians still argue whether such extravagance served nature or merely staged it. Did heavy moldings and mirrored corners create dark pockets where water quality went to mischief? Or did they simply frame the scene so human attention would linger long enough to notice when the eelgrass sighed? Manuals ever earnest warn that neither velvet draperies nor fringe valances should shade the glass. Your cat moonlighting as a curtain tester agrees by collapsing on the fringe and ending the debate by nap. Light choreography becomes half the hobby. You test morning sun across the wallpaper, then tilt a Japan screen to soften glare at noon. Some owners fit pale blinds behind the tank to act as a scrim turning fish into silhouettes and seaweed into calligraphy. Others perch a small mirror on the opposite wall so lamplight can steal over the water in the evening without the flame itself coming too near. You remember the flannel wrap from Winter Advice and imagine a tasteful tank shawl for drafty nights. Your second light joke arrives when you picture sewing a buttonhole for the hydrometer, which would poke through like a tiny periscope, offended but warm. Ornament creeps inside the glass too, though Goss's voice coughs from the shelf. Avoid the gaudy. You try to obey and still find yourself arranging a small arch of smooth stones, a fragment of dead coral, a shell with a polite doorway for a hermit to evaluate. Others surrender to fashion and plunk in a ceramic ruin, or a miniature classical column prompting your fish to rehearse tragedies among Doric reeds. You promise restraint, and then inevitably tuck one discreet shard of blue and white china among the pebbles, because the color sings underwater like a quiet bell. Manufacturers oblige the impulse. You pass a shop window where Majolica glows shell-rimmed jardiniere, seaweed relief vases, dolphin-handled ewers, and although none is strictly necessary for a tank, all conspire to make the room feel coastal. A cabinet maker shows you a fitted stand with a hidden drawer for nets brushes and that solemn little siphon that turns gravel into confession. Inside the drawer, you plan compartments, one for showstones, You grin, remembering the public hall's morning comb through, one for the manual's flannel, and one for labels so tasteful they could attend church. Sound and scent join the set. A painted tin water can spout long and swan-necked weights under the sideboard. A brass bell rests atop the stand to summon assistance when changing water becomes a two-person ballet. A small dish of dried lavender sits near the tank, not for the fish who neither mind nor notice, but for you who likes your oceans with a hint of garden. The housemaid learns the route from scullery to stand that avoids carpets and cats. The carpet learns to forgive. You glance up and find the room has learned a new posture. Chairs angle themselves toward the glass as if it were a hearth. Books drift closer, a volume of sea poetry, a sketchbook for visitors who wish to draw the loach from life, a pamphlet scolding against overcrowding that you keep visible as penance for earlier enthusiasm. The clock's brass face reflects a wavering fish-shaped glint at 1/4 which delights you out of proportion to physics. Your third light joke surfaces when you tell a friend you now own a marine chronometer, and he replies dryly, "It keeps tide, not time." Households experiment beyond reason. Someone commissions a narrow wall tank set between two rooms, drawing room on one side, breakfast room on the other, so a goldfish can supervise gossip and porridge with equal patience. Another places a shallow glazed trough along a windowsill and calls it the canal where minnows do 3 laps of empire before the kettle boils. A third fits a tiny nightlight behind the tank. You sit up late to find the anemones opening like sleepy lanterns, and you feel the day settle around their red, drowsy stars. Instruments and ornaments strike an uneasy truce. The hydrometer, having failed as a finger substitute, wins a fitted slot on the stand and looks almost elegant when not wagged like a baton. A little thermometer sticks to the side with a dab of wax. You hide it behind eelgrass when company calls as if the room itself had guessed you own practicalities. Nets hang from a discreet hook. The long-handled brush looks like a ceremonial scepter. The siphon coils like a tame snake waiting for a flute you do not own. Through all this, the fish remain beautifully indifferent. Your minnows ignore your Gothic tracery. Your shrimp walks across expensive mirrored glass as if it were any other rock. Your anemone opens to the color of the day, not the shape of the stand. Their refusal to applaud is paradoxically the charm. You have staged a theater and hired actors who never bow. They perform only for the quiet daily audience of oxygen light and your attention. When guests leave and the room exhales, you sit with a small satisfaction that is part craft, part curation. The aquarium did not just slide into your parlor. It taught the parlor to look, to angle, to hush. You have built a frame around patience, wood, brass glass, and inside it lives movement that answers to no tassel. Tomorrow you'll dust the dolphin feet and polish the mirror back and lift the lid like a proscenium to trim the plant tips. Tonight you watch the silver of a fish pass the blue shard and turn it into a comet. Somewhere outside a cart rattles. Somewhere in your drawer the flannel folds weight. Somewhere on the shelf the manual stays open to the page that says, "Avoid the gaudy while your stand blamelessly handsome pretends not to hear." You douse the lamp to a low bees warm glow. The frame holds the water answers and the room finally remembers how to be quiet. By now the aquarium has taught your parlor to behave, and almost without your noticing, it has begun to teach you to behave as well. You find yourself speaking more softly when you lift the lid, moving more slowly, when you trim the eelgrass, setting your teacup down far from the stand, so vibrations don't rattle the minnow's nerves. Patience, that stubborn Victorian virtue so often preached from pulpits, creeps into your elbows and fingertips by way of glass and water. You are to your faint surprise being morally improved by fish. Victorian culture had a name for this sort of thing: rational recreation, wholesome pastimes that educated the mind and calmed the spirit rather than agitating both with cards, gin, or gossip. One mainstream historical fact fits neatly here. Reformers, educators, and naturalists promoted nature study for families and schools, believing that quiet observation cultivated character as much as knowledge. An aquarium arranged with modest care and watched with steady eyes felt like a tiny classroom and chapel in one. You don't need a lecture about self-control. A shy blenny refusing to show itself until the room is calm offers the same message in better packaging. You test the notion in the most Victorian way possible. You keep a notebook. At first as water changes and feeding notes dates, amounts the occasional confession. Added too many snails. Staff now outnumber management. But soon you find yourself recording small wonders that do not require Latin anemone opened at 9-10 minnows, gathered in the light like pupils at a window. Shrimp conducted a thorough inspection of the blue shard, passed. The habit of writing what you see keeps your gaze honest. Even your jokes grow gentler under its influence. Naturally, the moral enthusiasm spreads beyond your mantle. Sunday school teachers borrow your tank for an afternoon lesson on creation. Children press their noses to the glass and try to outwhisper each other. A vicar praises the orderly economy of plants and fish sharing breath then, because Victorian sermons can never resist a tidy turn, encourages the congregation to do the same at home. You catch yourself smiling at the hydrometer, standing in its fitted slot like a parish verger, solemnly approving the salinity as if it were a hymn. And yet you are not merely improved, you are soothed. On a tedious afternoon, the tank refuses your fretfulness. You sit, shoulders creeping toward your ears, the city jangling through the window, and then notice a line of silver bubbles loosen from a leaf and drift upward in stately punctuation. The breath you didn't realize you were holding lets itself go. A minute later, you're counting not anxiously, but rhythmically, a 1, 2, 3 drift, 1, 2, 3 drift. The old parlor clock ticks along, suddenly a friend, rather than a scold. Your first light joke of the evening arrives when you think, at last a metronome I can keep up with, and the hydrometer, kept from baton duty by earlier rebukes, sulks in dignified silence. The educational uses multiply. A neighbor's daughter, home with nerves, is sent by her mother to sit with the fish. Later, the mother reports, half pleased, half scandalized, that the girl fell asleep in the armchair with an algebra book tenting her lap, the aquarium light making soft ripples on the page. Another parent reports improved penmanship after a fortnight of sketching sticklebacks. They are stern teachers, the parent says, of straight lines that wiggle. Manuals begin to recommend aquaria for convalescents. Place one, where morning sun will stir the plants, they say, and let the patient watch without obligation. The nurse's schedule does not change. The room's mood does. Quirky tidbit, a temperance club in an inland town installs a freshwater tank in its meeting hall, claiming that the contemplation of clean water supports sober habits. Members, it is said, were encouraged to take the oath of the goldfish drink nothing you cannot swim in, which is a charming slogan, if not a comprehensive policy. You picture a row of respectable men raising teacups to a carp who pretends not to notice, and file the image beside your collection of useful nonsense. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly believed aquaria could reform character, or whether the rhetoric simply justified a delightful novelty. Were the pious prefaces and moral preambles sincere expressions of natural theology, or were they the price of admission for bringing an exotic pastime into respectable homes? The diary evidence is mixed. One lady writes that the tank softens the tempers of the young gentlemen, which, if true, deserves a medal. Another confesses that she keeps it chiefly to silence after-dinner arguments. When tongues grow sharp, I extinguish 2 lamps and set chairs near the glass. Harmony returns within 5 minutes. Perhaps moral uplift and tactical truce are simply 2 fins on the same fish. You try the experiment yourself after a minor domestic squall. Nothing grave, merely an enthusiastic dispute about whether the showstones are too theatrical for a morning visit from the curate. Chairs are nudged toward the tank lamp, lowered voices follow the light. Within minutes, the room has adopted the aquarium's pace, long sentences, soft vowels, even the cat returning to her post as unpaid health inspector. Your second light joke swims up when you whisper, "Behold, the most effective marriage counselor in London is a prawn," and your spouse, unwilling to dignify the prawn with professional status, concedes that its bedside manner is excellent. Moral value threads through the care itself. A tank abandons you if you abandon it. Virtue in glass has a timetable. Algae thrive if you neglect them. Plants weaken if you fuss every hour. The best keeper is the one who remembers to be both firm and patient. You discover this balance the day you ignore your manual's warning and rearrange everything at once, rocks, plants, even the blue shard, producing a melodrama of sulks that lasts 3 days. The apology you offer the blenny is not accepted in writing, but your humility improves. The flannel, that comic emblem from Winter Advice, returns as a small parable. Sometimes the kindest act is to keep the world warm and then leave it be. Schools borrow your notebook to show pupils the difference between looking and seeing. The teacher has them list behaviors, feeding resting territorial dances, then match them to times of day. The lesson takes on its own rhythm observation as a daily office, like prayers with fins. A boy who rarely speaks in class points at a pair of minnows and says they cue, and the teacher writes it down because the word is perfect. You begin to suspect the aquarium is teaching vocabulary the city has needed all along. Patience, cue, hush, breathe. Not every moral claims success. A gentleman of your acquaintance insists that watching fish cures anger. Another grumbles that it encourages indolence. I stared in for 20 minutes and accomplished nothing, he says, to which you reply perhaps too sweetly. Yes, accomplished nothing very well. He departs unconvinced, but you note with satisfaction that his voice had softened by the door. Meanwhile, the housemaid confides she prefers dusting the stand to polishing the coal scuttle because the fish forgive streaks of theology sound enough for Tuesday. Your third light joke arrives on a rainy evening when you catch yourself reading a poem aloud to the tank, softly because anemones dislike declaimers, and you misplace a line. The goldfish with impeccable timing opens and closes its mouth twice. Correct, you agree. I did drop a syllable, and you correct it, and the goldfish, having secured appropriate penance, returns to its loop. You realize you've become the sort of person who accepts editorial feedback from carp and feels, surprisingly, none the worse for it. By lamplight, the moral and the medical continue their quiet duet. Your shoulders fall when the leaves release their bubbles. Your temper slows to match the lazy sway. Even your jokes learn to wait for the beat between breaths. You remember the public hall, its showstones and silver pointers, and understand that spectacle taught attention. At home, attention becomes a habit. The aquarium does not demand much clean water, modest food, a place in the light's path, and a keeper willing to become a little more like a tide, regular, calm, persuasive without shouting. When you finally set down your notebook, the room holds a hush that is earned, not imposed. You look at the stand's carved feet, dolphin still smirking the hidden drawer with its tidy instruments, the hydrometer resting from moral philosophy, the flannel folded like a benediction against frost. You listen to the almost sound of water thinking. If anyone asked what good a box of fish can do, you would point not to sermons or slogans, but to the shape of this our patient, attentive kind. You turn down the lamp to the bee's warm glow, the cat approves, and the glass answers with a softer mirror of the room. A final pearl of oxygen slips from a leaf and rises with unhurried conviction toward the surface. It breaks without drama, and for a moment the world feels improved by the exact amount of one bubble. You wake one chilly morning to find the parlor a little less dazzled by its own reflection. The water is clear enough, the eelgrass polite, the blenny still performing its vanishing act on demand, but something in the room's appetite has shifted. A bicycle bell rings in the lane outside. A neighbor waves a stereoscope card through your doorway with the zeal of a missionary. Someone's cousin has taught a canary to sing the opening of a hymn, and now all the children want birds. Your aquarium, once the debutante of the sideboard, gives a discreet cough and adjusts its flannel shawl. The mainstream historical fact arrives with the inevitability of dust. The mid-century aquariomania that had filled parlors and shop windows in the 1850s and 1860s simply eases by degrees in the later Victorian decades. Public institutions keep building grand halls at the seaside Brighton, a shining example with its 1870s showpiece, but in homes, the fashion cools. People don't abandon their tanks en masse. They just forget to polish them as often, or they promise themselves they'll rescape the interior next week and then move the hydrometer to a drawer for safekeeping. The drawer becomes a small museum of good intentions. Spare nets, a siphon with dignified dust. The showstones you meant to rotate at dawn. The reasons are surprisingly domestic. Coal soot prints a faint film on the glass that no one remembers to wipe until guests are due. Winter rooms dry out under better stoves. Evaporation draws white lace around the waterline, and the housemaid learns the art of topping up without turning the carpet into a map of the Thames. A new baby naps in the afternoon, so trimming plants must wait. By then, the anemone has sulked itself into abstraction. A gramophone arrives in those houses lucky enough to afford one, and the tank seems to frown at the base. You catch yourself doing the mental arithmetic minutes, to clean the gravel minutes, to settle the goldfish with a gentle pep talk, and you hear a voice that sounds suspiciously like your own saying, perhaps after Easter. Quirky tidbit, an advertisement in your favorite periodical offers sea blue backing varnish to restore the fresh aspect of youth to aging tanks, with a guarantee that the sea will appear 2 shades nearer. Another trumpets anti-evaporation glass caps, shaped like tiny pagodas. A third proposes a self-acting algae brush that resembles a hedgehog on a stick. You buy none of them, but keep the clippings in your notebook, partly for amusement, partly for the faint hope that a hedgehog might indeed tidy things while you sleep. Historians still argue whether the home aquarium decline is chiefly about maintenance fatigue or the gravity of newer amusements, the cheap thrill of stereoscopic Alps, the freedom of cycling clubs, the call of photographic plates promising your very own ghostly self. You can feel both tides tugging at your sleeve. On Tuesday, you mean to change a third of the water. On Tuesday, the neighbor offers a turn on his safety bicycle, and you, being human, opt for wheels. The eelgrass waits. It is tolerant, not saintly. You try, of course, to keep faith with your little sea. You polish the brass corners, you pat the dolphin feet and compliment their carvings. You schedule a sober Saturday for gravel and plant tips. But the schedule doesn't always listen. The snails, your unpaid sanitation staff, unionize again and cover the glass in calligraphy. The Blenny stages a strike and relocates behind the blue shard for 3 days. Your first light joke swims up when you scribble in your notebook, shrimp filed for retirement with excellent references and awarded a pension of 1 crumb. Meanwhile, fads jostle for mantle space. The fern case reasserts itself. Aspidistras swagger in iron stands. Stamp albums yawn for attention at tea. A nephew demonstrates a pocket camera and promises to photograph the fish if they'll hold still. They do not. The nephew invents motion blur a century early and declares it art. You suspect the tank is slightly amused. Neglect when it comes is rarely villainous. It is incremental. A small bloom of green appears on the back pane. You decide it looks rather natural, a painted backdrop of sorts. Plants grow leggy. You tell yourself they're aspiring. The waterline lace becomes a frieze you almost admire. Then one day you lift the lid and see the light has flattened the color, gone to pewter. You feel the pinch of guilt as clean and sharp as a new pin. You fetch the siphon, the brush, the bucket. You turn chores into ceremony. You bribe the cat with the warm spot on the chair. The room forgives you the instant you begin. There's too the slow drift of expertise elsewhere. The most ardent aquarists graduate to clubs and laboratories. The rest of us keep the memory of an anemone opening like a slow star and settle for goldfish with gentle manners. Goldfish survive fashions like furniture survives upholstery. Children love them, ants confide in them, and, as you well know, goldfish also run editorial services for your poetry. Your second light joke peaks out when you place the hydrometer back on the stand as a paperweight and declare you're promoted to management, while the goldfish, clearly the real manager, loops past with supervisory calm. If a tank is abandoned entirely, it never happens quickly. Dust thickens on the stand. A book migrates to the lid. A shawl is thrown over the whole arrangement temporarily. You visit a friend and find her aquarium half filled with dried grasses and fairy lights for Christmas. You make a sound like a punctured concertina, and then remember you do not own the patent on taste. A month later, she has returned water to the glass and discovered that even a repentant aquarium will accept apologies if they come with clean gravel. In some homes, the aquarium yields space not to spectacle, but to necessity. A sewing table must come nearer the window. A sick relative prefers the quiet corner. A servant leaves, and there's 1 pair of hands fewer for the house's 100 small tides. You stand with a rag in your hand and realize you have secured an understanding with time. Some wonders you keep, others you visit. The big public halls continue their gentle thunder. You make pilgrimages when you need to re-imprint your eyes with moving water. A different kind of decline has its own charm when a tank is deliberately simplified rather than abandoned. You decide to go freshwater only, but do it well, clean pains. A modest shoal, plants that breathe without dramatic moods. You move the mirrored back into retirement. You let the showstones become garden edging. You say thank you to the coral and give it a cloche on the mantle. The aquarium becomes less a spectacle and more a punctuation mark, comma, not exclamation. A small pause of green and silver between errands. You hear rumors that electric light, arriving by wires into certain brave households, changes the game entirely, brighter, steadier, kinder to plants, crueler to algae if placed with cunning. You toy with the idea and set it aside. Gas still hisses comfortingly, and you're not yet ready to invite a new technology into your little sea. Historians will someday measure how illumination altered aquaria. For now, the debate lives in letters with careful adjectives and polite duels of sir. When you think of the fad as over, you're only half right. The excitement of first the party, where an anemone shocked a room into silence the afternoon, a crab redecorated without permission, belongs to an earlier chapter, but the habit remains. On a quiet evening, the tank's light still ripples up the wallpaper. The clock still borrows a little glitter at 1:15. You still lose 5 honest minutes counting the pearls that climb a leaf and break like tiny vows on the surface. Your third light joke surfaces when the canary that rival for attention pauses mid-area to watch the bubbles and seems to approve. You assure the bird that professional courtesies are appreciated, so you dust the stand and keep a modest log. You resist new gadgets shaped like hedgehogs. You visit the public aquarium to remember how grand glass can be. You accept that fashions age, but attentiveness does not. When the room goes dark, the water keeps its slow counsel, and you feel again the small moral geometry of care, clear what you can simplify, what you must, and admit that not every hour can adore. The bubbles do not mind your errands. They only ask that when you return you stay long enough to see one rise. You stand again at your sideboard, feeling the familiar tug of water toward light, and then without leaving the parlor at all, you step forward into a quieter present where the glass is clearer, the seams invisible, and the hum behind the stand whispers rather than groans. What began as a Victorian curiosity has become a practiced domestic art. Pumps hide in cabinets, filters pull a soft weather through the tank, and a thin bar above the water slides sunrise and sunset across the leaves on a dimmer like a polite stagehand who finally got a say. You flick the light warm for evening and smile at how much of the old room remains. The chair angled toward the glass, the notebook on the table, the patient way your eyes start to slow. The legacy is everywhere once you notice it. The stand no longer carved with dolphin feet, unless you wish it still elevates the scene to eye level exactly as those walnut pedestals did. The glass still frames patience. The labels have migrated into your mind. The showstones of the public halls return in modern clothing as aquascapers' rocks and roots, arranged into quiet mountains and rivers that invite fish to glide like weather systems. You tuck one small shard of blue tile, because you could never abandon the blue shard, into the base of a miniature cliff, and that little chime of color rings the past forward without demanding applause. One mainstream historical fact hums beneath your feet. In the decades after those first London galleries, great public aquaria opened across Europe and the United States, then across the world, their tanks growing broader and deeper as glass and engineering learned to hold more sea. By the 20th century, the aquarium had become a civic archetype museum theater laboratory where schools, families, and travelers learned to read water together. The architecture changed, the lighting changed, the route maps changed. The impulse to lean in did not. You can feel the echo of Victorian manuals in the way modern care lists read, test this, change that, watch for this. But the tone is gentler now, more companionable. As if the book finally understands you will sometimes forget a step and need mercy alongside method. The flannel wrap for winter becomes a battery backup for storms. The tins and teacups for transporting shore creatures become oxygenated bags and insulated boxes that cross continents overnight. Your hydrometer, once waved like a baton, retires to the drawer, while a discrete meter does its quiet arithmetic in the cabinet. First light joke, you occasionally promote the old hydrometer to bookmark and tell it it's still central to the narrative, which it accepts with glassy dignity. The line from the Wardian case runs forward too. Terrariums, paludariums, little rooms of humidity where ferns and frogs share a cross-stitched horizon, cousins across time, each a lens for learning to attend. You peer into a modern public gallery and watch a child explain to a parent how the forest in the water feeds the fish above it. You watch the parent nod with real listening in their eyes. At home, you watch a single bubble climb a stem and remember the day you learned to count not minutes but pearls. Quirky tidbit. When friends travel with fish, now they carry heat packs and cool packs. The size of palms, snap them like magic, and tuck them beside double-bagged passengers who ride under live aquatic labels that seem both official and a little giddy. Somewhere a courier has learned the difference between fragile and please keep upright for this particular shrimp, a distinction that would have delighted your station master with a generous bucket. The old tin can's rhythm, tip-tip, breathe, lives on in the way you swirl new water before you pour it in, stirring in air like sugar. Historians still argue whether the Victorian aquarium craze planted the roots of modern conservation or simply rode along with an older, slower shift in how people imagine nature. Did parlors and public halls teach a generation to see the sea as a living community worth defending? Or did industrial anxieties and imperial curiosities merely stage nature in glass? Without changing policy, the archives offer both answers. You hold the question like you hold the net lightly so it can breathe, and notice how many modern aquaria now partner with rescue programs, captive breeding, and reef restoration. A tidy hinge where spectacle and stewardship finally share arms. You keep your jokes small on purpose because the fish prefer them that way. Second light joke, the snails still a union now operate under local 1875 in your notes and demand a raise in algae. You grant it with pleasure and an extra pain to polish. Third light joke, the cat promoted long ago from unpaid health inspector to chief compliance officer audits the glass by placing a single paw print exactly where you meant to clean next and files her report by sleeping on your instruction manual. You sign off on her recommendations immediately. What endures most stubbornly is the cadence. You still lift the lid with a hush. You still measure your week by the way the plants look on Wednesday. You still feel a room learning to behave around a small weather you've chosen to keep. In public galleries, designers now bend broad panes so sharks drift past like punctuation in a story you're hearing for the first time. At home, you bend your day to make room for the 5 minutes it takes to watch an anemone open. The scale changes, the grammar remains. New tools save you from some old comic disasters. Instead of brushing soot from panes, you set a silent sponge on a wand to skate along the glass. Instead of arguing with the gas lamp about midwinter light, you angle LEDs to give your eelgrass an honest dawn. Instead of tasting brine for salinity, you calibrate a sensor and offer your tongue better work tea. But the most Victorian habit, the notebook, persists as an app or a card tucked under the stand pearls. At 910 Loach, supervised gravel maintenance prawn available for counseling upon request. You remember the debates salt versus fresh spectacle versus solace and smile at how modern homes hold both without much fuss. A planted nature tank in one corner, a small reef in another, a tiny jar on the desk where a single shrimp conducts a daily inventory of calm. Some evenings you visit the big public hall to let its thunder lift your chest. Other evenings you sit with your own quiet tide and let its smaller breath steady your own. Both count, both teach. You think of the people who stood behind those old panes, keepers in damp coats, docents with silver pointers, visitors on tiptoe, and of the people who stand behind the new divers with headsets, aquarists with laptops, school children with pointed questions. You think of the way the glass taught all of them to look with patience until a hidden thing decided finally to be visible. If there is a single continuous legacy, it is not the furniture, the fittings, the recipes, or even the fish. It is the skill of waiting kindly. So you sit warmed by a bee's warm lamp, notebook open, cat asleep, snails industrious, and let the lineage rest where it began, a human leaning toward water to see what it will teach, and water answering in bubbles. The Victorians frame wonder in brass and flannel and words with long tails. You frame it in silicone and quiet and a dimmer that slides dusk across your own small sea. Either way, the lesson goes on. Keep the bubbles alive, and they will keep you honest about the pace of a good life. Let the room soften now, the edges feathering the colors, unbolding the glass, turning from window to lantern, and from lantern to a memory that glows without asking you to look hard. The water keeps its breath steady as a sleeping animal, and the plants lift their leaves just enough to let a last thread of silver climb and disappear into the surface as though tucking a loose thought into a drawer. You ease your shoulders down and let the chair learn your weight, and the quiet begins to graze around your ears like a friendly tide that knows its way in the dark. You remember a single older moment, the way a leaf released a pearl at 9:10, the way a child whispered cue, the way your own hand set down a cup more gently than before, and you let those small proofs drift together until they blur into something softer than proof, something like trust. The house holds still, the cat breathes her little hills and valleys. The stand is simply a line under the night, and somewhere in that modest geography, a minnow makes a turn that has no deadline and requires no witness. If there's a sound at all, it is only the nearly sound of water remembering light, and you remembering to breathe with it slower, with the kind of patience that does not strain or perform, but settles the way dust settles, the way evening settles, the way sleep settles when you stop calling it, and simply open a place for it to arrive. The lamp goes to amber, the glass answers in honey, the room agrees to be kind. Let the last bubble climb, let it break without a ripple you need to follow. Let your eyes close the way anemones close, unhurried, certain they will open when it is time, and let the night keep the watch that you no longer have to keep. Good night, sweet dreams.